Next topic, human influences on evolution. Any attempt to influence our own evolution has to confront the potential incompatibility of cultural and phenotypic fitness. For example, social, social and medical advances maintain alleles in particular groups or in our species as a whole. That would be deleterious in other organisms. We discussed two approaches to influencing our own evolution: eugenics and gene therapy, as well as human efforts to engineer the genomics of other species, all of which raise ethical concerns. So, movements to influence evolution through selective breeding and eugenics arose as one aspect of the application of Darwinian principles to society, like social Darwinism, although often not recognized as such. Eugenics continues to be practiced by individuals in their use of assisted methods of reproduction. Humans have been engineering the gene pools of other organisms since the origins of agriculture and the domestication of plants and animals. Today, genetically modified organisms like GMOs can commonplace. So, prevailing is human influence that when humans are present, altered evolution of other organisms is not the exception but the expectation. So let's have an introduction about this topic. Today we will be on just starting this topic. Later explanations will be dealt tomorrow. So longer human lifespans are generally thought desirable, but in fact, natural selection rarely influences the features of post-reproductive individuals, including features associated with longevity. Given the large size of human population and the limits on resources, lowering fertility might be advantageous, but biologically high fertility has selective value. A large proportion of the human population is or will be affected by alleles that persist because of forces that maintain genetic variation or because the intervention of modern medicine allows individuals with what might otherwise be deleterious alleles to live long and reproduce. These are the topics of the first and second parts of the chapter. So, first, human influences over human evolution. Humans now have the technology to change themselves and the world in which they live. Although cultural considerations can transcend many biological constraints, improvements in human lifestyles bring us face to face with biological limitations. Our biological heritage stresses early reproductive success, after which physical deterioration sets in. So increased life expectancy, reproduction into decades beyond our 30s, and our ability to contribute to society into our 70s and 80s all stand in stark contrast to this biological heritage. Human cultural development requires continued plasticity, adaptability, and longevity, but also is limited by biological decline as we age. Then increase in longevity and natural selection. In most organisms that attain reproductive maturity selectively early in their potential lifespan, surviving after reproducing tends to be short lived or non existent. So, in contrast, individuals in many modern human societies enjoy a long period of post reproductive longevity. Early in our own evolution, only about half the human population passed the age of 20, and not more than 1 in 10 lived beyond 40. Life expectancy remained between 20 and 30 years until the Middle Ages, 5th to 50th centuries. Then rose somewhat beginning with the Renaissance period in Europe. Life expectancy has risen sharply among Europeans, Americans, Japanese, and some others in the last century and a half, from about 40 years in 1850 to the present high 70s or low 80s. Less developed countries also have been dramatic increase. The major exceptions being these countries in Africa where the AIDS epidemic, poverty, and a war have reduced already low life expectancies to as little as the low 30s. So these changes in longevity are important. They indicate that as a result of improvements in sanitation, diet, and medical practice in developed countries over the last century and a half, natural selection on individual in those societies that has little influence on fitness, that is on the number of offspring produced, which more and more is a matter of personal choice. Further, many of the ills resulting from our changed lives, diabetics, heart disease, and cancer, affect us mostly in our later post reproductive years. So, consequently, there is little or no change for natural selection to weed out susceptibility to these ills. In biological terms, an individual who has produced three children and at the age of 50 develops cancer or other diseases with genetic components is no less reproductively successful than an individual of the same age who has produced three children but does not suffer from such disease. Our interesting longevity has had an even more dramatic impact on global population with major implications for humanity and for the world as a whole. This discussion of longevity, however, should not leave you with the impression that humans are no longer subject to natural selection. So, natural selection can readily be detected in populations in which technological change has been slow. Humans continue to adapt to changing environments, and those changes can be measured in rates of genetic change. In a study that looks at rates of genetic change in the historical context of migration out of Africa, Hawks et al. In 2007 documented that 7% or more of the human genome has changed over the past 40,000 years, and that the advent of agriculture correlates with the hundredfold increase in the rate of change in the human genome. The Tibetan Plateau lies at an average elevation of about 4,600 meters above sea level. Settlement of this plateau by humans several thousand years ago required adaptation to the low levels of oxygen at such altitude. The partial pressure of O2 at sea level is 13.3 kilopascal at 4,600 m. It is 4.7 kPa. Most people can cope with oxygen levels found up to around 2,500 meters, at which the partial pressure of O2 is 8.2 kPa, but at higher altitudes, humans can succumb to altitude sickness, the inability to cope with extremely low oxygen levels at higher elevations. Tibetans living on the plateau have adapted to these low oxygen levels. Part of that adaptation involves the widespread presence of two genes that are found only rarely in other populations, consistent with positive selection for the genes in humans living at high altitude. One gene, EGLN1, produces a protein involved in the formation of hypoxia-inducible factor alpha protein, transcriptional complexes, and major sensors of oxygen levels in cells that influence hemoglobin levels. The second gene, PPAR alpha, produces a nuclear receptor involved in the oxidation of fatty acids and energy metabolism, both of which are enhanced in Tibetans. Then, genetic birth defects. Despite improvements in medical care, alleles persist in human population that in other organisms would be classified as deleterious because of their negative effect on adaptiveness to the environment or on fitness. Here we discuss how such alleles are maintained in human population. So the number of children born with marked physical or mental abnormalities is conservatively estimated at about 20 to 25 in every 1,000 births in the United States. The mortality rate ascribed to congenital malformations accounted for around 15% of all infant deaths. Other abnormalities not immediately noted at birth may become apparent during childhood years. Such defects are more common than usually realized. In various studies, about 30% of or more of hospital admissions for children and 50% of all childhood deaths are ascribed to birth defects or to complications consequent to such defects. Although not all birth defects are genetic, the proportion of those that are high, the incidence those that are is high. The incidences of each individual genetic disorder is low. Cystic fibrosis is 0.05% of live births. Tay-Sachs disease is 0.001%. Trisomy 21 is 0.13%, and congenital heart defects 0.4%. So, summing the incidences of genetic disorders in humans, whether autosomal, X-linked, or chromosomal, gives a total frequency of around 2.6 of live births. If genetic defects such as muscular dystrophy that appears later in life are included, the frequency doubles to around 6%. If in addition we include less obvious conditions that nevertheless have strong genetic components, impaired resistance to stress and infection, the effects of harmful genes touch a significant proportion of the human population. Then population explosion. In most countries, infant mortality rates have declined markedly over the past century as a result of improved sanitation, nutrition, and medical care, resulting including control of infectious diseases. Infant mortality rates have fallen in more than 70 countries from 15% or more of all births in 1900 or less than 1%. Lower infant mortality comes at a cost, however. Symptoms such as cerebral palsy associated with premature birth cannot be brought down at the same rate as infant mortality, and so has increased in incidence. In most countries, however, it was and still is usual for birth rates to remain high for many years, even decades, following such a decrease in infant mortality. When combined with increased longevity, the result has been an exponential growth of the human population, an explosion that, at its height in the 1960s, saw a doubling every 35 years, a rate many thousands of times greater than that experienced in Paleolithic societies. Since that, the number of people has risen from a billion to the current 7.02 billion. Although the overall growth rate has dropped, the doubling time is now 61 years. And absolute numbers continue to climb. Today, about 2 lakh related people are added to the world population every 24 hours, by far the majority of them in developing nations. The US Census Bureau predicts the world population between 9 and 9.4 billion by the year 2050. This population explosion has major implications for the planet and all its inhabitants. The more people are there, the more food, water, space, energy, and other resources they need. The more resources consumed, the more waste produced. Our total impact on the environment depends largely on how many resources each of us uses and on how much waste each of us produces. Our per capita ecological footprint, which varies immensely between country, countries. A person living in the United States today consumes far more resources, producing far more garbage, and emits far more carbon dioxide and other pollutants than does an inhabitants of, say, Nepal. Furthermore, per capita resource use in industrialized countries, which already far exceeds sustainable levels, continues to rise. At the same time, hundreds of millions of people in developing countries are responding to improved economic conditions by adopting the patterns of resource use characteristic of wealthier regions. Then, food supply. Here we discuss the complexities of one specific concern associated with population growth: access to food. Current production through raising appears barely able to keep up with present requirements. What then of the future? This turns out to be a topic with many facets, some of them political. The list below is far from complete. The amount of arable, arable land is finite, and the amount of cultivated is at an approaching capacity is most countries. The average amount of arable land per person worldwide continues to shrink as populations expand and as land is taken out of production as a result of environmental problems and urban sprawl. A decline of more than 50% between 1950 and 2005 has been estimated. So, increasing amounts of land are used to grow food for livestock, a practice that ultimately results in production of far fewer food calories for humans per unit of land. Substantial amount of food are lost through faulty distribution and storage systems, pests and diseases, and graft and corruption. Extreme poverty means that a sizable fraction of the world's population cannot afford to buy nutritious food. At the same time, large surplus exist elsewhere. Unwise subsidies and policies, as well as increasing globalization and domination of agriculture by multinational corporations, distort production and make markets almost everywhere. In terms of future food production, considerable amounts of arable land remains unused in several countries. There is great potential to increase both yields and nutritional value of crops. As is evident from the list above, unless the political, environmental, and other problems that permeate agriculture can be overcome, it is unlikely that we will be able to feed the billions more who will be added to the world's production population in the years to come. Other threats to the food supply locally and globally include soil erosion, fertilizer and pesticide contamination, water supply depletion, global climate change, and extreme climatic events. In the meantime, famine remains a recurrent problem in some developing countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. Indeed, United Nations statistics show that 9 to 5 million people were suffering from chronic hunger in 2010, a billion in 2009. Improving the quality of life for an increasing population while ensuring that no one lives in abject poverty is surely amongst the most critical issues faced by the human population. Next topic of about maintenance of deleterious alleles will be dealt with the help of next video. Thank you for listening.